Imagine walking the cobbled streets of ancient Rome just after sunset. The air smells of baked clay, olive oil, and smoke. The noise of the forum has died down, and the wine shops are just beginning to fill. Somewhere near the Subura, a neighborhood of taverns and brothels, you pass two women. One is a prostitute, the other is a respectable wife. One of them owns property. The other is forbidden from even drinking wine. One can speak freely in public. The other is bound by her husband's will. One is protected by law. The other is not. But here's the strange part. It's not the wife who's protected. It's the prostitute. Yes, welcome back to Sleepy Survival, where logic takes a nap and history tucks us in with some of its strangest truths. Tonight, we'll be exploring something quietly outrageous: how sex workers in ancient Rome were sometimes more legally protected, economically independent, and socially visible than the women who were supposedly honorable. So grab your linen blanket, settle into your triclinium, and prepare to unlearn what you thought you knew about status. Like, comment, subscribe. If this is your kind of bedtime story, quiet rebellion, ancient law, and uncomfortable truths, tap that like button, subscribe gently, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. We love knowing who's drifting off with us from Bengal to Boston. Now, don't worry, we won't be revealing everything tonight all at once. Like the best Roman intrigue, the full story unfolds slowly, piece by piece. Each section will uncover a layer: law, marriage, visibility, risk, and the haunting power of respectability. But first, let's set the stage. The silent weight of being a Roman wife. Respectable Roman wives, matronae, were the image of honor. They wore stolas, walked modestly with their heads covered, and kept mostly to the private sphere. Their virtue wasn't just personal, it was political. A wife's chastity reflected a man's dignity, a family's legacy, and Rome's moral backbone. But being a matrona came with a strange contradiction. You had almost no legal independence. You couldn't own your dowry freely. You couldn't represent yourself in court. You couldn't control your body, your property, or your fate. Even if you were from a wealthy family, your father, then your husband, retained power over your decisions. Roman law, especially early on, granted pater familias, the male head of the household, tremendous control. He could even kill a daughter for adultery without trial. So while the matrona was celebrated in poems and statues, her real power was ghostly. She lived under a system that praised her by silencing her voice. Meanwhile, in the brothel, prostitutes, particularly those registered with the state, were officially known as meretrices. They were part of a social class called infames, meaning outside the boundaries of public honor. They couldn't run for office, serve in the military, or enjoy elite privileges. And yet, they could do something powerful. They could work. They could earn. They could own property. They could live outside a man's guardianship. Some even ran businesses. Some paid taxes. Some, especially freed women, arose to economic success. While matrones were draped in virtue and confined, meretrices were dismissed in words but allowed action. In a strange twist, prostitutes had more autonomy than wives. Was it respect or invisibility? Now, don't misunderstand. Prostitutes weren't admired. They were ridiculed, stigmatized, and barred from the upper class. But their lack of status gave them something shocking: the freedom from the burden of respectability. They weren't punished for speaking too boldly. They weren't expected to obey a husband. They weren't idealized. They were allowed to survive. In fact, because they weren't tied to family honor, they could engage in contracts, own slaves, run taverns, and even sue or be sued in court, rights that most married women did not enjoy unless legally emancipated. It was a case of being legally degraded but functionally empowered. And that's a pattern we'll trace throughout this video. Rome's dirty secret. Power often lived outside respectability. As you listen tonight, let your mind wander through a city that punished adultery with exile, yet filled its streets with phallic amulets and state-registered brothels. A city that honored wives with gravestones and ignored their voices in court. Let that contradiction lull you to sleep. The idea that the more you were honorable, the fewer rights you had. That in Rome, morality wasn't about justice, it was about containment. Ready to continue? In Section 2, we'll explore how Roman law viewed prostitutes versus wives in writing, the terms, the contracts, the courtroom rules, and what happened when boundaries were crossed. Sleep softly, and remember, some of the most uncomfortable truths are told in the quietest tones. The legal difference between wives and prostitutes. Let's drift now from the dusty streets to the parchment pages of Roman law, where words were power and silence could kill. In this section, we'll explore how ancient Roman legal codes distinguished between two very different types of women, the matrona and the meretrix. Both were deeply entangled in the Roman view of morality, but only one of them had the law on her side when it came to survival, ownership, and control. And strangely, it wasn't the one called respectable. Two classes of women, two systems of control. Let's begin with terminology. Roman law didn't simply categorize women by wealth or family. It used legal status as a tool to separate the honorable from the dishonorable. A matrona was a married woman of status. Her honor was tied directly to her husband's reputation and her family's name. Her behavior was her value. A meretrix was a woman who exchanged sex for money, registered, known to the state, and publicly recognized as outside the moral code. The matrona was put on a pedestal. The meretrix was pushed to the margins. But here's the twist. The pedestal was a cage. The margins were porous. Wives under Roman law, controlled from birth. For most respectable Roman women, life began under patria potesta, the absolute authority of the father. Even adult women were rarely legally independent. When they married, they could enter a system called manus marriage, where legal control transferred fully from father to husband. Under manus, a wife had no legal identity of her own. She couldn't own property. She couldn't make contracts. She couldn't testify without male approval. She couldn't even choose to leave her marriage easily, unless her family intervened. Even as laws evolved and free marriage, sine manu, became more common in the late Republic, cultural expectations remained rooted in obedience. A woman's voice was valuable only when it echoed a man's power. Adultery? A man could kill his wife for it, and if he didn't, the state might punish him for being too lenient. Money. Prostitutes under Roman law, taxed and registered, yet free. Now drift softly into a different world, the world of the meretrix. Unlike wives, prostitutes were required to register with local officials, often through tax rolls. They were classified under the legal category of infames, meaning dishonored or without public virtue. Infamia came with limits. They couldn't marry a senator, they couldn't testify in court as a citizen, and they couldn't pursue certain legal protections. But in many cases, they didn't need those protections because they didn't live under someone else's name. They could own property, they could inherit wealth, they could file contracts, they could even run taverns, own slaves, and hire staff. They were publicly shamed, yes, but they were legally allowed to live in ways that wives often weren't. It was a quiet kind of freedom, not born of respect, but of being removed from the system that claimed to honor women by silencing them. Contracts, clients, and control. Roman prostitutes were businesswomen. They negotiated prices, clientele, and conditions. Some worked in lupanaria, brothels run by others. Some operated independently out of private rooms, taverns, or even upper floors above shops. They made contracts, they hired guards, they paid rent, they kept records. A Roman prostitute could, for example, rent a room, pay her taxes, and even buy a burial plot, all actions unavailable to many matronas without a male guardian. In fact, some prostitutes were former slaves who, upon being freed, became legally known as libertinae and gained limited citizenship. Many became successful and supported families, lovers, or other freed people. So while society mocked them, the law didn't stop them. Reputation versus reality. This contrast forces us to ask, what is freedom really? Is it being praised in poets, sculpted in marble, and worshipped in tomb inscriptions, while having no say over your property or body? Or is it being insulted in public, but allowed to speak, work, and choose? The Roman system reveals a sharp truth. Reputation could be a prison. Disgrace could be a loophole. The meretrix had no virtue in the eyes of society, but she had movement. The matrona had virtue, but she had restriction. Rome didn't reward goodness, it rewarded obedience. What happened when wives acted like prostitutes? Here's where it gets darker. If a matrona behaved in ways that resembled a meretrix, dressing suggestively, appearing in public alone, speaking too freely, she could face severe punishment. Not just social shame, but legal action, exile, loss of dowry, even death. That's because the Roman legal system wasn't just about what you did, it was about who was doing it. A prostitute having multiple partners, expected. A wife smiling at a stranger in the forum, grounds for scandal. The wife bore the burden of moral representation. The prostitute bore only her own weight. A nighttime reflection. So as you drift into stillness tonight, consider this. Who really had more control in ancient Rome, the woman praised by marble inscriptions, or the one cursed by graffiti but quietly free? The law was clear and cruel. A man's respect depended on the silence of his wife. A prostitute, already dishonored, could not be shamed further, and so she was left alone. Sometimes history's quietest tragedies come wrapped in beauty, and sometimes disgrace hides the only form of freedom allowed. In the next section, we'll look closely at what these differences looked like in public life. Who could speak? Who could walk alone? Who was safe from violence? And who was not? Sleep softly, and remember, power does not always dress in honor. Public visibility and quiet control. Let us open our eyes just a little to the streets of Rome. Stone beneath your feet, balconies above. Women pass in different garments, different roles. Some whisper, some smile, some disappear. because in ancient Rome what you could do in public wasn't simply a matter of safety, it was a mirror of your status. And tonight we'll wander slowly through the crowded alleyways and hushed temples, noticing who was allowed to walk, who was meant to sit still, and how silence was crafted into law. Who was allowed to be seen? In Roman society, the ideal woman was one that was barely visible. Respectability for a matrona, an elite Roman wife, meant being indoors, at home, behind curtains, managing the household, weaving wool, raising children, and staying quiet. Public space was considered masculine. To be out in the forum, in the markets, or even just walking unescorted, these were signs of inappropriate boldness for a respectable woman. And yet, prostitutes were everywhere, not hidden, not even particularly secret. They worked in lupanaria, brothels, upper-floor rooms above taverns, porticos near bathhouses, and sometimes right on street corners. Their very presence in public was legal, accepted, and even taxed. It's an irony that's hard to ignore. The woman seen as the least honorable had the most freedom of movement. The one labeled virtuous was locked away. Clothing as control. Rome's obsession with appearances extended to dress codes. A matrona was expected to wear the stola, a long, modest garment that announced her respectability. She often covered her head with a veil or palla when outside, signaling modesty and submission. A prostitute, by contrast, was forbidden to wear the stola. She might wear a tunic, or even just a cloak, simpler garments that marked her status but also gave her mobility. What a woman wore didn't just reflect her class, it determined her legal protections. For example, if a veiled matrona was assaulted in public, her attacker could face severe consequences. If a woman in prostitute's clothing was attacked, the punishment was lighter, sometimes non-existent. Visibility came at a cost. Graffiti, shadows, and public space. Let's walk through Pompeii for a moment. Graffiti lines the walls, crudely carved, carelessly scrawled, often vulgar. Many of them name prostitutes directly. Marina gives good service. Felicia is sweet like honey. Lucilla charges 4 asses. It's easy to see this as exploitation, and yes, much of it was, but it also reveals something else: presence. These women weren't myths. They weren't locked in marble rooms or worshipped in absentia. They were named, recognized, talked about. In a world where matrona were expected to remain behind closed doors, a prostitute could leave her name on a wall. In some strange way, this offered a kind of permanence that respectable women never received, because a wife might die and be remembered as the modest, loyal spouse of Gaius, but a prostitute might be remembered as herself. Who could speak? Who could listen? In the courtroom, a respectable wife could not usually represent herself. Her voice had to be filtered through her husband, father, or male guardian. She could be present, silent, veiled, passive, but she could not argue. A prostitute, on the other hand, might be denied political influence or respect, but in many cases she could speak for herself in business, contracts, and sometimes even in disputes. The irony is as quiet as it is sharp. The woman denied moral recognition was allowed speech. The woman praised for virtue was denied her own voice. And no one thought this was strange, because this wasn't about fairness, it was about containment. Who was allowed pleasure? Let's touch gently on a strange restriction: wine. Roman wives, especially in earlier Republican periods, were often forbidden to drink wine. It wasn't just social etiquette. In some laws, it was treated like adultery or theft. A husband catching his wife drinking could punish her severely. Some sources say even kill her if he chose. Why? Because pleasure was tied to shame. A wife was expected to be chaste, restrained, even in her personal appetites. But prostitutes, they drank openly, in taverns, in back rooms, in parties. No one cared. No one punished them. No one judged them for it, because they were already judged. And so, they were free. Not respected, but free. The illusion of dignity. It's tempting to say that Matrona were simply victims, beautiful birds in gilded cages, but that's only partly true. Roman wives were not powerless. They could influence household economics, raise political sons, manage estates, and control social relationships from behind the scenes. Yet their visibility was controlled, their words filtered, their presence restricted. In many ways, they were hostages of an ideal, praised in poetry, imprisoned in practice, while prostitutes, branded with dishonor, operated with a different kind of currency, visibility, negotiation, self-direction. Even in danger, they had movement. Who got to rest? When the sun set over Rome, the respectable wife remained indoors, curtained, muted, sealed behind propriety. The prostitute may have worked through the night, but she chose clients, negotiated prices, controlled her space, sometimes poorly, sometimes with power. So who slept more soundly? The woman kept pure, or the one allowed to act? It's a question Rome never dared to ask, and perhaps neither do we. So, as you lie back tonight and let the flickering lamplight of history settle behind your eyes, consider this. In ancient Rome, the more respectable you were, the less you were allowed to be seen. Respect was not a shield, it was a collar, and those considered dishonorable often slipped through the cracks, living, working, speaking, quietly surviving. In Section 4, we'll explore what happened when these two worlds collided, when wives became scandalous or prostitutes sought respect, and how Rome punished the breaking of roles more than the breaking of laws. Sleep softly. History is watching. When the roles were broken. Sometimes the real punishments in Rome didn't come from breaking the law, they came from breaking your role. In this section, we'll explore what happened when a wife behaved like a prostitute, or when a prostitute sought the status of a wife, when a respectable woman stepped into the realm of visibility, and when a disgraced woman reached upward. The law could be cruel, but social expectations were even crueler. And the price of stepping outside your designated space could be exile, humiliation, or worse. Let's walk through the quiet moments where these boundaries were tested and watch how Roman society tightened its grip on those who dared to blur the lines. When wives became too visible. The matrona, the Roman wife, was supposed to be modest, still, and largely invisible. But Rome was changing. Especially during the late Republic and early Empire, some women began asserting influence in ways previously reserved for men. Some attended public events. Some spoke boldly in court. Some hosted salons or held sway in the political ambitions of their sons. This was viewed at best as bold, at worst as scandalous. Let's take the example of Claudia Metelli, a woman of high status during the late Republic. Claudia was well-educated, wealthy, and politically connected. She was independent, flirtatious, and unafraid of gossip. She lived visibly, hosted poets, had lovers. She wasn't a prostitute, but Rome treated her like one. Cicero, in a scathing courtroom speech, accused her of being a Medea of the Palatine, essentially a monstrous seductress who used sex and poison to control men. He mocked her dress, her voice, her confidence. She had broken her role. Not the law, not any contract, just the script Rome expected women to follow. And for that, she was dragged through the streets of public opinion, silently destroyed. The opposite was just as dangerous. Some meretrices became wealthy, respected, even beloved by powerful men, but they could never cross the line. For example, let's look at Volmunia Caetheris, a freedwoman and actress who became the mistress of both Brutus and Mark Antony. She was famous, intelligent, and deeply involved in elite circles. And yet, she was always introduced as a meretrice. Even her funeral, according to some records, was delayed because of debates over whether she deserved public mourning. Her relationships were public, her influence was real, but her status fixed. Because in Rome, no amount of wealth or charm could erase the legal mark of infamia. To change her status, a prostitute would have to renounce her work, and even then she could not erase her past. She might live in a villa, but never wear the stola. She could love a senator, but never marry one. The cage was made of ink and expectation. The lex Julia, controlling desire, controlling status. The boundaries between wives and prostitutes were so fragile that the state had to step in to police the categories. Under Augustus, a series of laws known as the Lex Julia de Adulterii formalized what was already culturally enforced, a strict moral code for elite Roman women. These laws punished adultery as a public crime. If a wife was caught with her lover, her husband had legal obligations to either divorce her or face penalties himself. If a father discovered it, he was permitted, under certain rules, to kill her and her lover on the spot. This law wasn't designed to protect marriage. It was designed to protect appearances. Roman men could continue to have mistresses, visit prostitutes, or engage in affairs without legal risk. But if their wives did so, the family's honor, and, by extension, the state, was seen as corrupted. What's more chilling, women convicted of adultery could be declared infames, legally classified the same way as prostitutes. Suddenly, a matrona could become a meretrice in the eyes of the law. She would lose her dowry, her citizenship, and her voice. Mirrors and misery. So much of Roman womanhood was based on contrast. The good wife was obedient because others were disobedient. The honored matron was praised because others were shamed. Rome needed the prostitute to define what a wife was not. But when the line blurred, when a wife laughed too freely, drank wine, walked unaccompanied, or dressed without care, society panicked. She was seen not as liberated, but as infected, contagious. Because if one woman stepped outside the script, others might follow. And then the structure, so carefully built on appearance, might collapse. The whispered shame of divorce. Divorce was legal in Rome and common. Both men and women could initiate it. But the social consequences were wildly unequal. A man who divorced might remarry, take a mistress, or carry on without damage. A woman, she risked being seen as used goods. If she had multiple husbands, gossip labeled her a wandering uterus. If she had affairs, the state might intervene. For prostitutes, changing partners was simply part of life. No one cared, no one judged. So in this strange way, freedom existed outside the house, outside the marriage. It's a chilling reflection. The more a woman was praised, the more she was watched. A closing thought. So as the oil lamp flickers low and your thoughts begin to slow, let's rest on this question. Who paid the higher price? The woman who was shamed from birth, or the one who was praised until she slipped? Rome's obsession with roles didn't just limit freedom. It punished any attempt to cross the line. And in doing so, it revealed a truth we still struggle with. Sometimes honor is just a performance, and shame a form of camouflage. In the next section, we'll explore what daily life looked like for prostitutes, what they earned, where they lived, what rules governed their days and their nights. Sleep softly, and let the silence speak louder than the laws. Life inside the brothels. Let's slow down now. Step softly through a narrow Roman alleyway, its walls close, the air heavy with heat, and the faint sounds of sandals brushing worn cobblestones. A door opens, a figure emerges, not a matron in flowing linen, nor a wife cloaked in virtue, but a woman whose presence was permitted and taxed. This is the brothel, not imagined, not hidden in metaphor, but real, physical, tactile, loud when it needed to be, silent when it had to be. And tonight, in this final section, we settle into the quiet economic rhythm of ancient sex work, the costs, the choices, the systems that turned bodies into currency, and how, strangely, those within that system sometimes navigated it with more control than women who bore rings and family crests. Let's step inside. Economics of the flesh. Prostitution in ancient Rome wasn't just tolerated, it was regulated. Sex was, in many cases, a business transaction, and the brothel, or lupanar, was the storefront. And just like any other profession, it came with costs, profits, records, and taxes. Prostitutes had to register with the aediles, magistrates who oversaw public order. Their names were recorded, their profession acknowledged. They were taxed under the vectigulum, a state-imposed sex tax. Even their earnings were considered legitimate income. A prostitute could be a slave, a freedwoman, or, in rare cases, a free-born citizen who registered out of necessity. And the brothel keeper, often a man, sometimes a former prostitute himself, acted like a landlord, a boss, and sometimes a jailer. The system was structured, visible, and deeply transactional. Let's look around the room. Stone walls, dim candlelight, hard bedding. No sheets, no pillows, just a platform or slab, sometimes made of brick, sometimes stone, often warm to the touch in summer and cruelly cold in winter. The rooms were small, barely large enough for 2 people, often lined along narrow corridors. Each cell had a curtain instead of a door, if anything at all. Privacy was minimal, noise carried. Names were scratched into walls, so were prices, vulgar jokes, drawings and statements of pleasure or disappointment. In Pompey's famous lupanar, some graffiti reads, "Euclea was here twice. Maritimus had 4 asses, well spent. Felix likes it rough." It's easy to laugh, But behind each carved word is a glimpse of a human exchange, one that cost money and left memory. Prices and payment. The cost of a night or a moment varied widely. Low-end services in basic brothels might cost just 2 to 4 asses, the equivalent of a cheap loaf of bread. Higher-end courtesans could charge dozens of sesterces, enough to fund a day's labor or more. Clients paid up front. Negotiation was part of the ritual. Some women had fixed prices, others adjusted based on demand, appearance, reputation, or desperation. And yet, even in these settings, some autonomy remained. A woman could say no, could turn away a dangerous man, could set terms. Not always, not safely, but sometimes. And those slivers of agency, those quiet decisions, separated the lucky from the lost. Contracts and control. In some cases, contracts were drawn up. Yes, contracts. Some wealthier courtesans entered into agreements with patrons. These weren't just financial. They included exclusivity, expectations, even clauses for gifts or housing. A wealthy Roman might fund a woman's living quarters in exchange for monogamous service. Others hired courtesans to perform at banquets, recite poetry, or simply be seen at their side. It blurred the line between sex and status. And for the woman, while she couldn't gain official dignitas, she could gain stability. A wife might be chained to one man's name and family. A prostitute might navigate multiple men, but own her own home. And that, in Roman logic, was power of a different kind. Daily routine in the lupanar. The day began early. In brothels, some women woke before sunrise, prepared themselves, and waited. Clients might arrive in the morning before work. Others came late at night, drunk and rowdy. Some days were busy, some slow. Festivals brought surges. Religious days brought silence. Between clients, the women might eat simple meals, bread, olives, fruit. They rested where they worked, sat where they slept, talked sometimes, wept sometimes. But they formed networks too. Older prostitutes guided younger ones. Some had long-standing clients who treated them with care. Some saved money and eventually bought their freedom, opening taverns or managing others. Not all did. Many were trapped in debt or locked into servitude. And many died young, from childbirth, infection, violence, or neglect. But even in this space, some carved futures out of dust. Power and protection. Because they were registered, prostitutes had legal recognition. They could bring cases to court, though not always with full rights. They could make contracts and be held to them. They could testify, but their words were often weighted less than a citizen's wife. Still, in comparison, a woman locked in a villa, unable to own property or speak in court without her husband's consent, might envy that recognition. Rome had built a world where the visible woman was the expendable one. But visibility also offered tools, and some used them brilliantly. Survival and legacy. We remember the emperors, the generals, the wives praised in funerary inscriptions as chaste and faithful. But we also remember women like Theodora, a former prostitute who became Byzantine empress, or Phryne, the famous Greek courtesan whose beauty allegedly saved her from death in court, or Egeria, whose advice shaped policy in the shadows. They weren't matronae. They weren't silent. They were women who moved through the economic systems of their time with awareness, risk, and, sometimes, survival. Even if their names were carved in graffiti, not marble. A quiet ending. So now, dear listener, as you let your eyes rest and the sounds of Rome fade into parchment shadows, consider this. Freedom and shame are not always opposites. Sometimes they coexist, awkwardly, fiercely, and undeniably human. A prostitute in ancient Rome may have been watched, taxed, and mocked. But she could speak, she could move, she could exist in public, in stone, in stories. And a wife, honored, veiled, idealized, might vanish behind silence. Tonight, let's remember both. Sleep softly, and let history whisper through the spaces it once sealed shut.